So here's what I ended up with. Let's listen to a playback, and then I'll talk about what I did. Okay, so we see I still stuck with two voices, kept it pretty simple. This time we have a little more of the counterpoint going on, something I really like to do. Welcome to this video about scoring in relative keys. This one we're going to check out relative major. This series of videos comes after my scoring in major videos. I had 4 different videos showing 4 different major keys, starting on C major to make it easy. And here we are again, starting in C major for this. And we see C major on the left with the Roman numerals correlating with each chord, and of course being in the major scale. Then on the right side, we see G major. Now this is where it's good to know the circle of fifths. If you know your circle of fifths, or you can just look at a picture of it, you'll see that C major is basically the first key that's at the very top that you're going to see, like 12 o'clock on an alarm clock. Then from there, you could either go to the left, and you could access the keys that start to have flats, and of course you can make your way around. And then if you're at C again and you go to the right, you're accessing the keys that have the sharps. So since this translates from key to key where you have your relative major keys, I'm going to teach this in the easiest way. And I think that it's always starting in C major. And then since we're going to use 2 different keys in this, the next key I'm going to use is the next key to the right, which is going to be going up the keys that have sharps. So this is why I chose G major. And now we want to compare G major to C major in a few different ways. First off, of course, we'll just look at the notes. Right away we see G major has an F sharp. So now it's good to keep in mind here that we see F sharp is on that 7th note of the scale. Okay, so it's a good trick to note that the new sharp note is always going to be on the 7th note of the new scale. This means that we go to the next key that's up a fifth. This means moving clockwise on the circle of fifths. For example, from C to G here. Each time we move that 1 step clockwise, we have a new note. And that new note is going to be that 7th note in the new scale sharpened. So we went from C major, now we're in G major. We can see the last note of the scale G major is F. So that's how we know that it's going to be F sharp. And it's also good to keep in mind that when we're going up keys clockwise, we're going up a perfect fifth. I'm not talking about flat keys here, but I'm just going to mention this, and that is that the new flat note for your flat keys when you're going counterclockwise is always going to be on the 4th note of that new scale. So if we start on C major and we go to F major counterclockwise, we're actually going down a fifth. And in the scale of F, the 4th note is going to be a B, and that B becomes a B flat. Now this is just one thing to make sense more of the keys and to understand this more. Memorizing the order of flats and sharps is a better way to go about this, but it is good to understand all of this in multiple different angles. So the next thing to look at is not just the notes, but actually the chords in each key. And since these keys are relative keys, they're right next to each other, there's only a 1 note difference. And we'll see, in fact, a lot of these chords are going to be the same chords, but rearranged because they're in a different scale. So let's go over to G major, and let's look at each of the chords. So let's keep in mind that we're starting in C major here. As we see from the key signature, there's nothing labeled there. It means we're in C major. And then we're going to be going to G major. And that's what we're going to be doing in this writing exercise. We're going to have these 2 different keys in this passage. So now if we look at all the chords in G major and we compare them to C major, we see something pretty interesting. We can simply see all this from the Roman numerals labeling everything without thinking about it too much. We can see in the scale of G major, our first chord is major. And of course that's G major. We see C major also has G major. Our next chord in G major is A minor. If we go to C major, we see there's also A minor. And these are not just the same quality of chord. The reason why these chords are the same quality is because they actually contain the same exact notes. So if we look at that A chord in either C major or G major, we see A, C, E are the notes. Okay, let's move on to the next chord. In G major, we see B. B is a minor chord. Okay, so that's where we have a difference here. in C major, we have a diminished chord. Now this is really easy because here we are in G major. We're looking at that B chord. It's B minor because if we look at the notes, it is B, D, F sharp. So the reason why this is a different chord than C major is because we have a different note in there. And it's that simple. So now this sheds light on the fact that all we have to think about is what's that new note in the scale, and that's how we're going to see the chords that are different from C major. So again, we move on to the C chord in the G major scale. We see it's a C major chord. This is because it contains the notes C, E, and G, and it doesn't contain that note that is different in the scale. Then we move on to the fifth chord. We see D, F sharp, A, so we can right off the bat tell that this chord is not going to be in C major. It has an F sharp. Furthermore, we see that this is a D major chord, and in C major, we have a D minor chord. Okay, so I think you get the point now. We move on to the sixth chord. We see E, G, B, the same notes as would be in C major, so we can right away tell that both these chords are going to be the same quality. They have the same notes. They're both minor, as you can see. And then the seventh chord of G major is a diminished. The seventh chord of A major scale is always diminished. And we see this makes sense because we have an F sharp, A, and C. F sharp and A create a minor third, and A and C also create a minor third, so we see that it is a diminished triad. Okay, so now we get the idea of relative keys, and we have the relative major here with C major and G major. And this should be pretty easy because the only new note that we're going to use when we go into that new key is going to be that F sharp. And then furthermore, everything we learn from this can be translated into other keys. And starting real simple here is actually good because you're going to get the real foundational aspects of all this. You're not going to have to think about the other complexities of other keys, and you're going to be able to focus on the topic of relative major and also modulating to those relative keys. Now let's get into scoring. I'm actually going to create a game plan here and then execute that. And the game plan is going to be create a chord progression. The idea is going to be to start in C major, create a chord progression, and then modulate into G major. In other words, change keys into G major, and then have either the same or probably a different chord progression. And then from there, I might either stay in G major and end there, or I might get back into C major. Okay, so I'm going to create the plan right now. Let's see what I do. Okay, so here's what I did. I labeled this special for this video. I normally wouldn't do this, but I didn't want to make this too confusing, so we see the Roman numerals and actually have each chord labeled with that just to make this easier. So if you're trying to follow along and maybe get tired or something, hopefully this will make it easier for you. As I said, we started in C major, so we see there's nothing saying that we're not in C major, so we're in C major the whole time on the first line here. We go down here on the second line, and we see at right up here, it says G major up at the top, and then there's the colons next to it. So that's my indication that we're going to be in the key of G major right here, starting right here. And then we see the chords correlating with G major here. We can see I ended on G major on the tonic chord actually, the chord G, and I also created a little chord progression. First of all, though, we can see I added a new measure in the beginning here. So this is known as an anacrusic start. You have a beat before the first measure. It's kind of interesting here in a 3/4 time because it sort of makes that first measure 4 beats, dun, 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 and then you get into the 3/4 time after that. So before we get into writing notes, let's just look at the chord progression. So I started the anacrusic on chord 5. It's a good little trick. Pick that up in a lot of classical music and stuff. That goes into chord 1, and then we see each measure is going to have a chord. This works really well for 3/4 time. It's a little interesting doing multiple chords per measure when you're working with 3/4 time, and doing one chord per measure, or sometimes even one chord per 2 measures, works really well in 3/4 time. Of course, it's all up to the sound that you want to make. Okay, so now after that anacrusic start, we see a chord progression of 1, 2, 4, 5. This is in C major, and then it goes down to chord 6 here on the second line. We're still in C major, but what we got to understand is chord 6, A minor, is in C major, and it's also in G major. So that's our pivot chord there, the A minor. But the chord before that, the chord 5, is a G major, and that's also in C major and in G major. Okay, and this goes into why I chose the chords that I did. But moving on to the next measure, we see we get into G major. In the key of G major, we have a chord 5, we have that D major. The reason why we're now in G major and we weren't before is because now we have a chord that is not shared in C major. The D major with the D, F sharp, and A is only in G major. The D chord in C major is D minor without that F sharp in the chord. So now that we're in G major, we stay there and we go into the next chord. We have a chord 4, which is a C major. Of course, that's also in C major. Of course it is. But now we're in G major, so it is kind of interesting now hearing that C major chord now that we're going to be in G major. That's what that's setting that up to do. And then from there, we go to chord 1. So we're ending there on the tonic G major, further establishing that we're in the key of G major for the ending of this little passage. Okay, so if we pay attention, I had a 1, 2, 4, 5. It went into chord 6 here on the next line, and then it goes into G major, where I have a 5, 4, 1. Okay, so now this next part is a little complex for a beginner video here, so you don't have to understand this. You don't have to watch this part. You can just skip this part. But just to give you an idea of why I chose these chords that I did and the reason why I did, when we look at what would be the 5th measure here with the anacrusic start, we have chord 5, which is the G chord. This is shared between C major and G major. So of course we're not in G major yet, but if we were in G major, this would be the 1 chord. And then the next chord is also shared between the 2 keys. So if we were in G major for the next key down here on the measure 6, where we have the A minor chord, this could also be chord 2 in G major. And the reason why I'm saying this is because before we had a 1, 2, 4, 5. And now what I'm explaining is if we are looking at this like we're in G major, this is a 1, 2, and then it gets into the actual G major here, chord 5, chord 4, then 1. So it's like a 1, 2, 5, 4 instead of a 1, 2, 4, 5. I just wanted to explain that because that's the reason why I did that. Part of how I score my music is I like to have a reason for why I do things, and I like the end sound when I do that versus when I don't. Okay, so now I've talked about this enough. Let's write the notes. So here's what I ended up with. Let's listen to a playback, and then I'll talk about what I did. Okay, so we see I still stuck with 2 voices, kept it pretty simple. This time we have a little more of the counterpoint going on, something I really like to do, where we hear the interplay between the bass voice and the melody. They're kind of switching off a little bit. You're hearing a little bit of both. The bass is not only serving as a support, but it's actually serving as its own individual melody, where we could listen to the bass by itself, it would be its own melody, and we can listen to the top by itself, and it'd be its own melody. But they're working together, and they're creating harmonic moments with the chords that are being chosen and how I wrote this. If you like the writing style of counterpoint and you want to get more into that, just check out my counterpoint playlist. You'll see that linked at the end of this video, and if YouTube changes things, it often does, you'll see that in the description as well. That's a whole playlist, and there I teach 2-voice, 3-voice, and 4-voice counterpoint for all the species. I also have practice exercises you can print out at your own house or do on your computer, and everything is free. Okay, so now let's talk about how I wrote this, why I wrote this. So we can see I started off with that anacrusic start. Again, it's something that I picked up on reading some classical music, listening to some classical pieces. I really like the sound of it. It sounds really good in a 3/4 time signature, and it sounds really good when you start on chord 5 going to chord 1. We see I only have 2 voices here, so adding that 3rd voice could add some extra notes, which could fill in the chords more, but we see with only 2 voices here, it did a pretty good job at expressing each of the chords, and this has to do with the amount of notes in each of the measures. We see a mixture of quarter notes and eighth notes, which allowed me to play a lot of the notes in the chord and also leave room for some interest with some passing notes, auxiliary tones, and things like that. Here in 3/4 time, we have a downbeat on beat 1, and then we have 2 upbeats, versus 4/4 time, where we have a downbeat, upbeat, downbeat, and upbeat, where we have the strong beats with 1 and 3, and the weak beats 2 and 4. Here in a 3/4 time, we only have beats 1, 2, and 3, and the only downbeat, again, is that first beat. So I'm treating that accordingly with how I filled this in. And we can see right off the bat a few different patterns. First off, in what would be measure 2 after that anacrusic start, we see that I have a quarter note, 2 eighth notes, and then a quarter note in the bass voice. And for the next 3 measures, I do that same exact thing. Next, if you pay attention to here what would be measures 2 and 3, and you compare them down here to 6 and 7, you will see they're nearly identical. The only difference is, instead of C major like in measure 2 here in measure 6, all those same notes are transposed down a third, and now everything is the same, but it's a third down, and it's expressing the chord A minor now. This goes into the next measure, where again everything is identical here in measure 7 as it is here in measure 3. The only difference between these two measures, 3 and 7, is that there's the F sharp here instead of an F natural, which makes the measure 7 highlight a D major chord, while the measure 3 highlights a D minor chord. Okay, so having measures 2 and 3 basically identical to 6 and 7 allows the listener to hear that, and that'll cause them to start to follow along. They're following the melody now, and they're going to think they know where it's going. It's adding predictability. So that's why there, after measure 7 here in measure 8, I break away from using the same notes. I use the same rhythmic pattern in the first 2 beats, at least for the melody, where I have the 2 eighth notes leading up to a quarter note. And then I didn't know what note to put after that quarter note, so I decided, why not just not put a note, because I don't want to do a half note or something. And I like the sound of that. That also inspired what I did in my bass voice because of that. And then in the next measure, I originally had all quarter notes. I thought it sounded kind of cheesy, especially where I have the parallel octaves here. D, D, going to F sharp, F sharp. So I made it sound less cheesy, adding these string of eighth notes. And it still has a little cheesy value to it, which I kind of like music when it's a little bit cheesy. So I like it the way that it is. And these 2 measures before the last measure help build up to the last measure, because here on the third to last measure, we can see I left out that 1 note, and basically because of what you were expecting 2 eighth notes here, because of what was previously written, and how I told you the measures before this got us to follow along, which led us to here. So we're expecting 2 eighth notes there, and there's a quarter note rest. Down below, also on beat 2 of the same measure, we were expecting 2 eighth notes here. That's just a quarter note. So these little things are actually slowing it down a bit. And then in the second to last measure, we do have the 4 eighth notes, but then it stops on a quarter note. We're down below in the bass voice. We have a quarter note as well. And then it leads us to that dotted half note. It's not like a finale ending or something super significant. We can only do so much with 2 voices here. And something that's good to keep in mind is that you don't always want the ending to a melodic passage to sound too much like a final ending to a song or like a really strong ending sound, because you probably want to save that for the end of the actual piece. So that's why oftentimes you'll see endings of passages like this going into a half cadence where you go from chord 1 to chord 5 and you end on that chord 5. But again, I want to keep things simple. I'm slowly making these videos a little more complex as I'm adding in these other topics, but as you can see, we're still in C major. We went into G major, we only had that F sharp, and in all, it was pretty easy. We saw in this one, I didn't really fill it in with you as I went. I did that in my previous ones. I have a good amount of videos where I do that. So in this one, I just showcased where I did the chord progression, and you can see where I filled in the notes. And if you look through my channel, I do have enough videos to teach you how to read the music and stuff like that. I actually just got through a series of videos that does exactly that. So from here, you could always pause the video, you could read what I wrote, and make sense of how I wrote what I did, why I probably wrote what I did. I explained a good amount of it, but now you can go and pause the video and look for yourself. And I've done this to plenty of YouTubers where they've shown me something they've wrote, and they didn't really explain as they were going. They just said, here's the idea. They show the end product. So then I have to sit there and read everything. And I think those are some of the best lessons, because you have to get your gears grinding. You really have to think of things yourself. You have to answer the questions, and it makes for a really good learning lesson. I guess the one thing that I do want to add before I finish this whole video about relative major and stuff is that we can see what really establishes that new key is making sure that you add that note that is in that new key. Because here with 2 voices, I could have added chords that contain the F sharp, and I could have dodged my way out of not actually using that F sharp note, which is the note that's different from C major. So because I did use F sharp, then this established that we were in fact in G major now a lot better than if I didn't. So just remember, when you are establishing that new key with that new scale, you really want to make sure that you emphasize that new note that's in that scale. And you could even do this in moments like passing tones and whatnot, but just make sure that you add that new note of that scale to really reinforce that. And this is all just to help you reinforce that new key So of course, if you wanted to do something ambiguous and not reinforce that key very much, then you wouldn't add that new note of the new scale. Okay, so that's the end of this. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you can let me know, like the video. So until next time, take care and goodbye.